Hi, I hope you guys can hear me okay. So Tanse, Mio Kisika, Tapwe, Kananaskamitin, Monica James, Oche Nitha, Peter Ballantyne Cremation. So, hello, good day. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Monica James and not Monica Fox. That's actually Kyle Bobby Wash's cousin. He got that wrong in the intro. So, my name is Monica James and I'm a member of the Peter Ballantyne Cremation in northern Saskatchewan. I actually live and reside in a small town just north of Winnipeg. So when I was first asked to speak at an agricultural sustainability conference, I was kind of wondering, am I actually the best qualified person considering only 4 short months ago I learned the difference between a cow and a heifer? One thing I can tell you is my agricultural knowledge is minimal. I've been learning a lot since joining FCC 3 years ago, but I'm definitely well versed in the barriers that Indigenous people and nations face when they go to access capital from a financial institution. So I've spent over 20 years supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs, enterprises, and business access capital, working in Canadian financial institutions, trying to break down those barriers, but really educate those within the system on what that looks like and how we need to be moving forward. So here's my topic. I'm actually joining to talk to you today about the role of Indigenous-led capital in really reshaping Canada's agricultural future. So I'm going to be talking about why history and policy matter, especially when we're talking about who farms, who scales, and really who benefits. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm actually not even in Winnipeg. I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis people in Saskatoon. So I want to set a clear intention for our time today. This session is how systems have shaped outcomes, not about individual fault. Agriculture depends on land, capital, and time. Until today, we're actually going to be looking at really who had access to those, who were denied those things, and what that has really meant for farming success and intergenerational prosperity in Canada. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a question that frames everything we're going to discuss today. If agriculture is about land, capital, and time, then what happens when one group is denied all three of these for over a century? So over the next roughly 20 minutes, I'm hoping you leave with two things. One, you really have a deeper understanding for the Indigenous perspective and a clearer sense of what moving forward looks like responsibly. So we talk about reconciliation, it's really leaning into reconciliation and what it can really look like in agriculture and financial systems. So along the way, I'm actually going to share a couple of book and documentary recommendations to really help you understand Canada's journey with Indigenous agriculture. So the first of the three learning recommendations is the book right here. It's called Clearing the Plains. It was written in 2013, and it really examines and put under a microscope Canada's policies and how they deliberately undermined Indigenous food systems, land dispositions, and agricultural suppression on the prairies. So Canada didn't actually fail Indigenous farmers because they lacked knowledge or work ethic. That's not true at all. It actually failed them by designing systems that made success impossible. Next slide. So we're going to move through 4 different parts. And one is, I think that we always need to start at the beginning. And as an Indigenous person, we always need to start with the truth, even if it isn't the great, even hasn't been very beneficial to Indigenous people. I think the first place that we all need to start is truth. So we're going to talk about Canada's truth and history. Then we're going to talk about intergenerational barriers created by some of the policies that Canada had put into place. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what Indigenous-led capital means in practice, especially where I work at Farm Credit Canada. And then I'm going to close it off with a couple of success stories. I might actually add the success stories as we go through, because I think by sharing examples and stories as I'm trying to relay a point, I think that's going to help with your learning. So we're going to go on to the next slide. So this photo was actually taken in 1915, and it's of the military recruits from File Hill, Saskatchewan, and they're posing with a leadership from government. I'm not exactly who that is. It was actually, the source is the Saskatchewan Provincial Archives collection. So I'm going to take you back a little bit to after World War One. So in 1919, the Soldiers Settlement Act was enacted for a couple of reasons. So the federal government started this, and it was done for two things. One, to increase agricultural production in Canada, and number two was actually to reward the veterans for their services for fighting for Canada. Unfortunately, the reality is the way that it was set up didn't work out very well for a couple of reasons. And the biggest one was typically the land that these individuals were given were poor quality agricultural land, or they were too far from a market. Some of these veterans actually had little or no farming experience at all. And then they really realized that the debt burden that it came to running a farm was too high for them. So in 1942, the federal government really redesigned that first act and they renamed it. And it was called the Veterans Land Act. And this was created to actually better support veterans when they're returning from the war. And a couple of those things, the key principles behind that were that these individuals returning from the war were given government backed loans with smaller down payments. They had longer repayment terms, and they actually supported those that wanted to do full-time or part-time farming. They helped commercial fishing, and also for those that were looking to construct a homestead on their farmland. So really overall, the Veterans Land Act was a huge success because it accomplished a couple of things. It really helped contributed to long-term agricultural farms here in Canada, which is a good thing, but it really built, the second thing is it built intergenerational wealth. The dark side of both of these acts is that they were built on systems that, one, excluded Indigenous veterans and Indigenous farmers from these exact same opportunities. These individuals that were returning from the war that were Indigenous were excluded. They were not allowed to access cheap government loans. They were not allowed to access support in terms of getting the skills to start and run a farm. They weren't given these same benefits. They were actually told, go back to your reserve, go back to your home. The other unfortunate thing is not only did it exclude Indigenous veterans, but these acts by the federal government, they had the power through the Indian Act that started in the late 1800s to expropriate prosperous agricultural farmland from reserves. So it excluded Indigenous people, and on top of that, it expropriated the farmland that was actually on reserves. Next slide, please. So if you find this intriguing and you might think, did this actually really happen, Monica? I invite you to watch this documentary. It's called Forgotten Warriors. So if you're involved in Canadian agriculture in any way, this is a must watch, because everything that I just told you in the previous slides, it will give real life examples and firsthand stories of what that looked like. So this documentary is actually part of the National Film Board, and it really tells the story of Indigenous men and women who voluntarily served in the Second World War. But unfortunately, when they ended up returning home, these systems discriminated against them and excluded them from many of the veteran benefits. And in some case, it lost their own reserve land. So this is actually firsthand testimony, and I think it's really important and a good watch for those that are involved in this. Next slide. So intergenerational wealth, as we know it. So we're going to talk about intergenerational wealth and intergenerational barriers. So intergenerational wealth really only applies to non-Indigenous farmers. So we need to talk about how this happens. So the number one way in Canada to build intergenerational wealth is through the transfer of assets, but really more specifically, land or real estate. So what happens when you own the land? Well, when you own the land, you can go to your bank and you can use it as collateral, and you can get out a loan, and they have the land security. When you're able to get capital or get credit, you're able to scale your farm in whichever way you want. The second thing is the next thing is as you're able to scale, what do? You're really building your equity. And what happens with that is you're able to transfer it on to the next generation. Next slide. So now when we're looking at an Indigenous farmer, it's not called intergenerational wealth, but intergenerational barrier. Because Indigenous farmers, on the other hand, can't build intergenerational wealth the same way. And the biggest reason is because their land is restricted. So, what exactly does that mean? Because aren't they able to go to the reserve and don't they have land out there? Well, yeah, they do. But I'm not sure if everybody actually knows this. But First Nation reserve land is not owned by the First Nation. First Nation reserve land is actually owned by the federal government. So if you don't own the land, that land is what we call it's restricted. And so there's rules around how that land can be used. Believe it or not, when a First Nation actually comes to Farm Credit Canada and they're looking to get a loan, sure, there's ways that you can look after it. You can look at doing this. So instead of doing a regular mortgage, you would do something that's called a mortgage of lease. So essentially, what that means is they don't own the land, they're actually leasing the land from the federal government. Sure, you can take a mortgage of lease, but what we need to do is we, as a Farm Credit Canada or any financial institution, you actually have to go to the federal government and say, hey, you're actually the landowner of this. You've leased it to the First Nation. Can we actually put a charge on that and put a mortgage of lease? So typically what ends up happening is you're dealing with Indigenous Services Canada. They're going to be looking at things on the land, what it's going to be used for. And these mortgage of leases have to be very, very specific in terms of what the land's going to be used for. And if the loan goes into default, what ends up happening, what the land can be used for. So if you want the definition of colonialism, that's it. First Nations need to go to the federal government still today to ask for permission how their land can be used. Now, there are some that are going through land codes, which is a totally different subject, and we won't start going down that road. But just so you know, First Nations, they have restricted land. They don't own their land. They can't use it as collateral. When you can't use it as collateral, guess what? You're not able to get any credit. And it's really tough that way. Just to kind of close off this one point is intergenerational barriers is that since they don't own the land, it's restricted. They're not able to get credit. They're not able to really scale. They're limited in the way that they do that. They have to bootstrap it, which means they have to take the own money they have in their own genes at the current time. And then because of that, they're not able to scale in a meaningful or an impactful or a big way. It really impacts their ability to build equity and transfer that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I've been with FCC for roughly about 3 years. And prior to that, I spent 20 years at another financial institution where I led the Indigenous financing team. So this picture here was taken in July of 2023, and it was my very first farm visit while I was working for FCC. So as you can probably see by what I'm wearing, you'd think that this was the girl's first time actually visiting a farm, which you're not far off. I used to work in commercial banking, and this is how I would dress every day. So when I went to the farm, I felt a little bit out of place. And this is my first farm tour, and it was in Cowessess First Nation. So there's over 3 million acres of arable land on reserve in Saskatchewan. 3 million acres. That's a lot of farmland on reserve. And the harsh reality is over 90% of that farmland is either being leased or rented out to non-Indigenous farmers. So back in 2016, Cadmus Delorme became the chief of Cowessess First Nation. And Cowessess actually has over 100,000 acres of farmland. 80,000 they own and it's off reserve, so it's fee simple, and 20,000 is actually on reserve, which we know is owned by the federal government. So Cadmus had approached FCC. I was not at FCC at the time, and approached the president of FCC and said, hey, we want to do farming on our reserve. We want to go from 0 to 2,500 acres. And the president at the time was just said, I'm not too sure how we're actually going to do that. It took FCC 2 years to help Cowessess First Nation start a farm on that reserve. 2 years. So this actually leads back into that intergenerational wealth. When you don't actually own the land, banks don't know how to do loans when you don't actually own the land. And I remember when I went on this tour, Cadmus wasn't chief anymore. He had just finished his term as chief. We went out for lunch with him afterwards. And, I was proud. I was working at FCC, super excited for the work that FCC was going to be doing, rolling up our sleeves. And so he said to me over lunch, he's like, Monica, so what are you doing at FCC? And, what do you hope to do? And I told him, we want to help nations get into farming. We want to be able to help and able to access capital. And I gave him the big corporate speech. And he waited until I was done. And he said, what, Monica? He's like, that sounds all good. But until banks can really see how to value the land that's on our reserves, even though we don't own it, until we can actually collateralize that land and see the true value of that land, we won't be able to progress. He left me with something. He said, what, if we want to actually see farming in our home fire, we need to change the way that financial institutions work. So we talk about Indigenous-led capital and what exactly it means. It means having an Indigenous worldview. It means understanding the importance of culture and history and language, what fire looks like, and understanding residential schools and understanding the Indian Act. We need to bring that perspective to financial institutions so they can actually see. The biggest job that I do is I take my Indigenous worldview, but also Western worldview, which is the financial institution that I work at, and try and bridge that gap to help them both understand. We can't do everything that the nation is looking for. And if FCC wants to continue lending the way it has for 70 years, we're never going to be able to help. So it's about both of them being able to work together and bridge that gap. And quite frankly, what's important to Indigenous-led capital is rebuilding relationships. I was speaking with an individual. I was at the 150th commemoration signing of a treaty at a First Nation in Saskatchewan. And I happened to just started chatting with somebody. He happened to be a First Nation farmer on reserve. And I told him what job I did at FCC. And he said that he was an FCC customer. So I thanked him for being an FCC customer. And I said, so, how are things? He's like, well, I'll be honest. I've been a customer at FCC for 8 years and it hasn't been good. It's actually been quite clunky and hard. So he was not a customer of FCC's Indigenous financing team. He was part of our regular portfolio. And I said, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you explain a little bit to me what happened? He said, you know what? I came to FCC 8 years ago, and they flat out told me that because I live on reserve, I couldn't come to them to get capital or couldn't get them to get lending. So if you lived on reserve 8 years ago, you were automatically declined. Unfortunately, this individual had to go off reserve to find somebody who is non-Indigenous to co-sign the loan for him. That is not what reconciliation looks like. We need to change the way that we're actually doing things. As the old saying goes, when you're feeling uncomfortable is when you're growing the most. The third thing, typically when somebody comes to an institution and you think, who is the beneficial owner? Who is the one that is going to benefit from this business? You can typically trace the business ownership down to a single individual. In the Indigenous space, for a nation-owned entity or enterprise, the individual benefit doesn't exist. It's for community benefit, which banks have a really hard time getting their head around, because we also look at, on top of land, we look at personal credit. We end up taking a look at personal net worth, so what kind of assets individuals own, and taking a personal guarantee of security. Well, when you're working with a First Nation-owned business, none of this stuff actually exists. And so FCC was declining these deals because they didn't have the right people to get them to bring in that Indigenous worldview to understand we need to be lending in this space. All this goes to say is that FCC is really understanding what that new starting lineup is because if we're going to wait until nations and First Nations people actually have a substantial amount of equity and land ownership, we're never going to be able to lend to them. So we're really readjusting our starting lineup and really meeting our customers where they're at. A big thing that we do here at FCC is we're removing barriers. So getting our company to really understand what these barriers look like and how we need to be changing the way that we lend. One of the things that when we talk about removing barriers, so as I'd mentioned before, the land on reserve is actually owned by the federal government. So if a nation wants to put a building on reserve, banks can't get a mortgage. They have to get a mortgage of lease. So we had a nation come to us. And so if you ever have the chance to hear Cadmus DeLorme speak, I highly recommend that you go and listen to him. He has a lot of things to share. I went to an event with him and he was the guest speaker at a food event in Winnipeg. I sat and I had lunch with him and it was great. He knew who I was. And then he was the guest speaker over lunch. And he talked about Cowis's journey in terms of economic development, food, and agriculture. And when he was on the stage, he shared his truth about working with FCC. And he went up one side of us and down the other. And he said how it wasn't great to work with FCC, the amount of hoops that they had to jump through and the barriers. It was just so tiring and daunting. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to remove those barriers. So that loan for Cowsis took us 2 years to authorize. Fast forward to last summer. We had a customer, a First Nation, wanted to go from zero to farming. So instead of getting into crops, they're actually getting into cattle. And one of the areas that they're looking for financing was for building on reserve. They also need some equipment and they needed a whole bunch of cattle. So with the building on reserve, when I was working with our FCC credit team, I said, we're not going to take a mortgage of lease and we can't take a mortgage. But what I want to do is I want to do a loan that looks and sounds and feels like a mortgage, but it's not a mortgage. Because a mortgage would mean a mortgage of lease, which means colonialism. And we got to go ask the federal government for permission for these nations to do economic development on their land. So in the absence of having a mortgage of lease, FCC is getting really uncomfortable, but I'm making them comfortable, understanding that we need to be doing these deals. So we did a loan. It's an unsecured loan on reserve, a building for the nation. So we're really trying to move what this looks like here at FCC. The last thing that I want to share with you is FCC is embarking on a multi-year, first of its kind in the country engagement, and it's called the Indigenous Agriculture Food Systems. And this engagement is actually being done to really help understand what Indigenous food systems mean for people across the country, not just here in the prairies. I'm proud of what I do. I work for a Crown Corporation, and the first thing that we do is we lead by purpose. It really aligns with my morals, values, and beliefs. I love what I do. I love that I get to work for a company that really listens to my truth and my history as a Cree woman, but also being able to share those and help bring them along to understand the realities that Indigenous nations and Indigenous people face. FCC is the only Canadian bank with a team dedicated exclusively to supporting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in agriculture and food systems. Next slide, please. So this is my third and final recommendation. It's a book recommendation. So it's 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. It's a really short read. It's not hard, and it gives you a really good explanation of how the Indian Act has really affected land use, farming, and really economic participation. So many of the laws that were affecting Indigenous people were actually combined to create the Indian Act in 1876. So the actual photo that you see here is a permission slip that would have been required in order to leave the reserve. There's something called a permit and pass system. So it wasn't really exactly a law or regulation under the Act. However, the Indian Act really gave the Indian agent power to be able to enforce who came and who left and why they were leaving. They were really under the hand and the cloak of the federal government. Next slide, please. So this is the last thing that I'm going to leave you with. This right here is a picture of Cadmus DeLorme, and he makes fun of this picture. He said, you know what, I was going to be in a parade and someone said, we need to get a picture of you, so put on your headdress and hop on a horse. And what I want to share with you is that this moment that we're in, it's something that we inherited. We didn't create this. However, we are the ones that are able to change, and I invite you to look at some of those recommendations and those documentaries and those books to really understand. And as you're going forward to be able to think about somebody from a different perspective and why they aren't sitting at the table. Miigwech, Teneke.